Jamaica stands as one of history's most rebellious territories, so defiant that the British Empire literally deported its freedom fighters to Canada just to achieve some peace. This tiny Caribbean island, located 90 miles south of Cuba, repeatedly humiliated one of history's greatest empires through centuries of resistance and rebellion. Originally called Semaca by its indigenous people, meaning land of wood and water, Jamaica became a symbol of resistance where escaped slaves built secret mountain kingdoms and colonial powers faced constant defeat. Despite being only the third largest Caribbean island, Jamaica packed more resistance per square mile than anywhere else in the colonial world. Before reggae, jerk chicken, or even the name Jamaica existed, the island belonged to the Taíno people. Far from being primitive, the Taíno were sophisticated farmers who cultivated cassava, sweet potatoes, and corn. They invented the hammock. Yes, that backyard staple originated in Jamaica. Their society featured complex political structures led by chiefs called caciques, with villages housing up to 3,000 people. The Taíno lived peacefully, fishing and farming in their tropical paradise, completely unaware that in 1494, their entire world would collapse with the arrival of Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus discovered Jamaica on his second voyage, though you cannot discover a place where people already live. Columbus claimed Jamaica for Spain, but the Spanish found no gold, their primary interest. Their solution was brutal: if we can't mine gold, we'll mine people. They enslaved the entire Taíno population, forcing them into devastating labor. The result was genocide. Within just 50 years, 2 generations, disease, violence, and slavery reduced the Taíno population from approximately 60,000 to just a few hundred. An entire civilization was nearly exterminated. Needing labor, Spain began importing enslaved Africans around 1517. However, these Africans refused to accept their fate. Some escaped immediately into the mountainous interior, creating free, hidden communities. The Spanish called them cimarrones, wild or untamed. Today, we know them as the Maroons, and they would become instrumental in Jamaica's resistance legacy. In 1655, Oliver Cromwell decided Britain needed Caribbean territory. After failing to capture Hispaniola, British forces settled for Jamaica instead. When the English invaded, the Spanish fled to Cuba but executed a strategic move that would haunt the British for centuries. They freed their enslaved Africans and directed them to fight the English. These newly freed people joined existing Maroon communities in the mountains. The British kept the name Jamaica, English pronunciation of the Taíno name, established Spanish Town as their capital, and transformed Port Royal into what became known as the wickedest city on earth.
You cheated me, that roll was fixed! Stand down, or you'll lose more than your coin! Get your hands off me!
Port Royal in the 1660s made modern Las Vegas look tame. Pirates, privateers, merchants, and prostitutes created an atmosphere of absolute chaos. Pirates would squander entire fortunes in single nights. The city reportedly had 1 bar for every 10 residents. Violence was so routine that sword fights barely drew attention from drinking patrons. The city's most famous resident was Captain Henry Morgan, who raided Spanish colonies from his Port Royal base. The British appreciated his work so much, they made him lieutenant governor, equivalent to making a bank robber chief of security. But on June 7, 1692, at exactly 11:43 am, karma struck. A massive earthquake caused liquefaction. The ground literally turned to liquid. In 3 minutes, 2/3 of Port Royal slid into the ocean. Over 2,000 people died instantly. Ships were carried inland and deposited in former streets. Today, Old Port Royal sits underwater, perfectly preserved, earning the nickname Pompeii of the Caribbean. After Port Royal's destruction, Jamaica transformed into a massive sugar factory powered by human suffering. By 1700, Jamaica was Britain's most valuable colony. Sugar was white gold, and Britain would commit any atrocity to produce more. The numbers are devastating. Between 1655 and 1838, over 800,000 enslaved Africans were brought to Jamaica, 800,000 human beings with dreams, families, and stories reduced to property. Conditions were beyond horrific. The average enslaved person on a sugar plantation survived just 7 years after arrival. The work was so brutal that plantation owners calculated it was cheaper to work people to death and purchase new slaves than to maintain their health. But the British fundamentally misunderstood something crucial. You can chain bodies, but you cannot chain spirits. Resistance was constant. Enslaved people poisoned masters, broke tools, burned cane fields, and escaped whenever possible. By the 1720s, the Maroons were driving the British insane. These weren't just runaway slaves hiding in mountains, they had built sophisticated societies with governments, armies, and distinct cultures. They regularly raided plantations, freeing enslaved people and stealing supplies. In 1728, Britain launched the First Maroon War. For over a decade, British soldiers in bright red coats stumbled through Jamaica's mountains, getting systematically eliminated by Maroon guerrilla fighters who knew every trail, cave, and ambush point. Legendary leaders emerged. Cudjoe led in the west. Queen Nanny commanded in the east, a military genius and spiritual leader who, according to legend, could catch bullets and redirect them at British soldiers. Whether literally true or not, she undeniably led her people to repeated victories against a supposedly superior military force. By 1739, the British were exhausted. They had spent fortunes, lost countless soldiers, and achieved nothing. They finally negotiated. The Maroons received recognized territory, self-governance, and freedom. In exchange, they agreed to return future runaway slaves and help suppress rebellions, a clause that would later prove problematic. In 1760, an Akan chief named Tacky launched a rebellion. This man had ruled a kingdom in Ghana before being sold into slavery. Imagine the psychological devastation of going from king to property. On Easter Monday, April 7, 1760, Tacky and approximately 100 followers struck. They killed overseers, seized weapons, and began liberating plantations across St. Mary Parish. Within days, thousands joined. Tacky's ambitious plan was to overthrow British rule entirely and establish an African kingdom in Jamaica. For a moment, success seemed possible. Rebels controlled significant territory, and the British panicked. But the treaty with the Maroons proved decisive. The British called them in. A Maroon marksman killed Tacky. The British decapitated him and displayed his head on a pole in Spanish Town as a warning. The rebellion continued for months, but was eventually crushed. Over 400 rebels were executed, many burned alive or publicly tortured. Yet Tacky's rebellion sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. It was one of the largest slave rebellions in the Americas, terrifying colonial powers everywhere. By 1831, slavery was becoming indefensible even to the British public. Sam Sharpe, a Baptist deacon who illegally learned to read and write, organized something brilliant: a general strike. Starting Christmas Day, 1831, enslaved people across western Jamaica simply refused to work. They demanded wages and better conditions. When plantation owners refused, the strike became a rebellion. This wasn't random violence. Sharpe's followers burned crops and buildings, but generally avoided killing. They wanted to destroy the economic system, not necessarily the people running it. Over 60,000 enslaved people participated, making it the largest slave rebellion in Jamaican history. The British response was savage. Over 500 rebels were killed, including Sam Sharpe, hanged in Montego Bay. His last words, "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery." But Sharpe's rebellion was the final straw. Reports of British brutality shocked the public. Churches that had supported slavery suddenly faced questioning congregations. Within 2 years, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. Jamaica's enslaved people were freed on August 1st. Queen Nanny graces the $500 bill, one of the few women on any country's currency. Jamaica gave the world reggae, Bob Marley, Usain Bolt, and jerk chicken. But more importantly, it taught that no empire, however powerful, can permanently suppress humanity's desire for freedom. From the Taíno fighting Columbus to the Maroons outsmarting the British, from Tacky's rebellion to Sam Sharpe's strike, from Paul Bogle's march to independence, Jamaica's history is one long, beautiful refusal to submit. It's a history of tragedy and triumph, suffering and strength, oppression and the eternal human refusal to accept it. This small island repeatedly embarrassed empires, where enslaved people built free kingdoms in mountains and resistance became a way of life. Sometimes the smallest islands cast the biggest shadows on history.